spoke of Mr Alfonso as caring for and being devoted to Mr Longworth. They lived together in a comfortable flat in West London where their neighbours thought well of them. It was their tragedy that you, Yostin Mosquera, came into their lives and on the 11th of July last year killed them both. I now have to sentence for you for these premeditated and thoroughly wicked crimes. The only sentences I can pass are of life imprisonment. I have to either set a minimum period before you can apply to the parole board for release, or order you be detained for the rest of your life. If I pass a minimum term, I must deduct the period you've already been in custody, 466 days. The statutory surcharge applies. I can only proceed on any factual basis if I am sure of it. You are a Colombian national, and as such you will be deported if you are ever released. You came to know Albert Alfonso through a sexual relationship the two of you had. It was transactional in that he paid you, but it was legal and consensual. Mr Alfonso invited you to visit him in London, and in June last year you came for the second time. You were well looked after, with a trip to Brighton, gym membership, language lessons and trips to bars, all arranged and paid for by Mr Alfonso. You began to research the value of the flat which Albert Alfonso owned, and no doubt that seemed to you a vast amount of money. It was naive to think you would ever be able to sell the property after Mr Alfonso and Mr Longworth were dead, but I'm sure you hoped to do so. Computer searches show that you also began to consider ways to get rid of your victims. On the 18th of June, you investigated buying a chest freezer, obviously as a place to store their murdered bodies. And by the 4th of July, you were translating phrases to allow you to ask for freezer to be delivered to the flat. On the 27th of June, you were stealing Mr Alfonso's bank details. On the 8th of July, you researched where to hit someone on the head to kill them. Around midday on the 8th of July, you murdered Paul Longworth. He was 71, a retired handyman, a harmless, amiable person who had done you no wrong. He and you were both in the flat. You probably placed a plastic bag over his head before, I am sure, delivering a series of savage blows with a hammer. When you had killed him, you hid his body under his bed and no doubt made some basic efforts to clean up before Albert Alfonso came home from work. At about 10 p.m. that same day, you murdered Albert Alfonso. He was 62, a hard-working man who had shown you kindness and generosity. You and he began one of your sex sessions as you'd done before. When he was kneeling, you took the knife you'd hidden nearby and very deliberately cut his throat. His brutal killing was captured on the various cameras he habitually set up to record your sessions together. He put up some resistance, but he was caught unawares by a younger, stronger man, and you were able to cut his throat and push his body to the floor. You then danced with pleasure at what you'd accomplished and immediately set about trying to empty his bank accounts. Over the next 2 days, you managed to steal money from Mr Alfonso. You had a freezer delivered. You went out to a bar and arranged to go out again the following weekend. You sent messages to Mr Alfonso's workplace pretending they were from him, explaining that he was going away. You set about disposing of the bodies of the two men you had killed. You chopped them up, removing their heads, legs, and in Mr Longworth's case, his hands. Their heads were left in the freezer while you arranged for a man with a van to drive you and 2 cases containing the rest of their bodies to Bristol. You ended up on the Clifton Suspension Bridge. I am sure that your aim was to throw the cases full of body parts off the bridge in an attempt to dispose of them. This was a hopeless endeavour, as the bridge has CCTV, security staff, and a high wire fence along its length. Being an incompetent criminal, however, does not count as mitigation. When challenged, you fled. I am sure your plan was to return to the flat in London and carry on disposing of the evidence of your crimes. You had asked a young couple you met in Bristol if the trains back to London ran all night, and you'd arranged to go out for a drink in London the next weekend. Instead, you were arrested at Temple Mead Station. Since your trial, I've ordered a psychiatric report. It's been completed by Dr. Bernard Chin and Dr. Norma Estrada, to whom I express my thanks. It concludes there is no diagnosed mental state that amounts to mitigation. The doctors noted as traits that you are capable of being charming and charismatic. You grow bored easily, and at times you tell lies. Dr. Chin noted features of you that match the International Classification of Diseases definition of personality dysfunction, namely self-centeredness and a lack of empathy. Anyone who witnessed your trial will have no difficulty in accepting all those findings. Within the doctor's detailed and careful report is an account you gave to them of witnessing the killing of other children when you were at school in a town in Colombia. One when you were 10 years old, another when you were 14. The doctors have not shied away from finding you were at times dishonest when speaking to them, but there is no suggestion that the history of witnessing the violent deaths of other children was untrue. Dr. Estrada's view is that while those experiences did not inhibit your ability to reason or exercise self-control during these offences, they may have shaped the way you view violence. Dr. Estrada has the advantage of being a native Latin American Spanish-speaking forensic psychiatrist with regional familiarity of Latin America. Although it is a slight finding expressed in cautious terms, it may be it provides some partial explanation for your callous and brutal conduct in killing 2 harmless older men. As an adult, you are responsible for your actions, but being exposed to such trauma as a child proffers some mitigation. You are now 35 years of age. You had no previous convictions either here or in Colombia. That is a significant piece of mitigation, though a shadow is cast over it by 3 other offences for which I passed sentence this morning. Your laptop contained thousands of appalling pictures and films of the gross sexual abuse of very young children. In deciding on the minimum term, I must consider the guidelines set down by Parliament in Schedule 21 of the Sentencing Act 2020. The most relevant parts are: 1. If I conclude each murder involved a substantial degree of premeditation or planning, or each murder involved sexual or sadistic conduct, the starting point would be a whole life order. 2, if I conclude the murders were done for gain or were of 2 people, the starting point is 30 years. 3, amongst the specified aggravating factors I must have in mind are a significant degree of planning or premeditation, the fact that a victim was particularly vulnerable through age or disability, and the concealment, destruction, or dismemberment of the bodies. Counsel for the prosecution and defence have referred me to a number of decisions of the Court of Appeal. I'm grateful for all their work and learning. The most relevant propositions to this case are that the different starting points are not to be implied inflexibly, but must fit the justice of the individual case based on the facts as I find them to be, applying the criminal standard of proof. While a judge can impose a whole life order when the criteria under the relevant paragraph of the schedule are not met, those cases are probably rare. See the case of Height, 2008, England and Wales Court of Appeal, Criminal 2500. The Court of Appeal have also stated that the phrase in the schedule about a murder involving sexual conduct was intended to cover circumstances where the acts which resulted in the death of the victim were sexual in nature or accompanied by sexual activity that increased the ordeal of the victim or the depravity of the murder, or both. See the case of Walker, 2007, England Wales Court of Appeal, Criminal 2631. Though those words are not to be treated as an all-encompassing definition, see the case of Mottram, 2022, England and Wales Court of Appeal, Criminal 954. The prosecution and the defence have made submissions in writing and orally today. I accept some of those arguments, and they're reflected in the rationale for my conclusions. I need to explain why I rejected other arguments, 3 advanced by the prosecution, 1 by the defence. I cannot be sure you engaged in planning that was substantial. You are an odd man who conducted many thousands of searches on your laptop. I cannot be sure that you actually decided to carry out these dreadful killings until early July. I also note the weapons you used, a hammer and a knife, were in the victim's flat already. In my view, that counts as significant planning, but not substantial. I do not accept that Mr Alfonso was particularly vulnerable. True it was, he was facing away from you in a position that allowed you to take him by surprise. But the posture of a victim cannot normally amount to an aggravating factor. 3, the fact you and Mr Alfonso were engaged in sexual activity does not meet the test explained by the Court of Appeal, whereby a killing involves sexual conduct. This was the regular way you and he conducted yourselves, and that fact does not make the crime worse, dreadful though it was. 4, I reject the assertion that there was an element of grooming or coercive control by Mr Alfonso. You were already a sex worker when the 2 of you met. Your account of being kept a virtual prisoner and of a reluctance to engage in some types of gay sex were manifestly untrue, given the evidence of the witness, James Smith, of your movements in London, and the websites you had created and run in Colombia. I accept there was an economic imbalance, which was the reason you committed these murders, but that does not amount to any sort of mitigation. These were undoubtedly murders committed for gain, which means the starting point for the minimum term I must impose is 30 years. There are serious aggravating factors. This was the murder of 2 people, an additional and extremely serious aggravating factor. given the offence being committed for gain has already attracted the 30-year starting point. 2. Paul Longworth was 71 years old and in poor health, so he was particularly vulnerable. 3. There was a significant degree of planning and premeditation, though there is a degree of overlap between that and the fact you killed for gain. 4. There was the gross dismemberment of both men's bodies, leaving their heads in a freezer in London while seeking to throw their torsos and severed limbs into the River Avon. The cumulative effect of those aggravating features, above all the murder of 2 people, is such that I might either have imposed a minimum term of approaching 50 years or decided your case merited a whole life order. However, I draw back from those outcomes because of your lack of any previous convictions here or in Colombia, and because of the mitigation that you may have been brutalised when, as a child, you saw the murder of other children. The sentence for both offences of murder is life imprisonment with a minimum term before deductions of 42 years. Those sentences have to be concurrent to one another. I stress that is a minimum. You may never be safe to set free. I deduct the days already served. On both count 1 and count 2, the murders of Paul Longworth and Albert Alfonso, the sentence is life imprisonment with a minimum term of 40 years, 264 days. You can go down, Mr Mosquera.
And we've just heard the sentencing there of Yostin Andres Mosquera, 35, who was sentenced to 42 years to be served concurrently. So 2 sentences for the 2 murders of Albert Alfonso, 62, and Paul Longworth, 71. Some very gruesome details that were released there about the way that Yostin Mosquera murdered Albert Alfonso and Paul Longworth. The judge describing him as an odd man, also mentioning that on his computer, a huge amount of very graphic images of the sexual abuse of very young children was found. He also mentioned a medical assessment which did find that Yostin Mosquera did have a personality dysfunction, which included lack of empathy and self-centeredness. Now, if Yostin Mosquera, who is originally from Colombia, will be released, and the judge was mentioning that he may never be deemed safe enough to be released, but if so, he would then be deported to Colombia. So let me just remind you of the details of this case. Yostin Mosquera, sentenced today for the murder of 2 men to 42 years. Now, Mosquera killed the civil partners, Albert Alfonso, 62, and Paul Longworth, 71, last year at their flat in Shepherd's Bush, West London. We heard how he used a hammer and a knife to kill them both, and he had been engaged in a sexual relationship with Albert Alfonso, 62. Now, Yostin Mosquera was a sex worker when he met Albert Alfonso. So it was a legal transactional sexual relationship. That's how the judge called it. And he did kill the 2 men, Albert Alfonso and Paul Longworth, before decapitating and dismembering them and dumping body parts in Shepherd's Bush. The 2 heads we heard in a freezer, and then the bodies in a suitcase that was left on the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol. Now, we've just had the sentencing of Yostin Mosquera, 42 years for murder. Going to take a quick break now. We'll bring you the rest of the day's news after the break. Stay with us.